Welcome to the Sleepy Bat. Tonight we're heading deep into Viking territory, but not to talk about raids or battles. We're going inside the longhouses to explore what really happened after dark. Now grab your blanket, sink into your pillow, and let's return to a world of firelight, mead, and nights that were anything but quiet. Picture this. It's the year 987, somewhere along the windswept coast of Norway. Not as some romanticized warrior, but as an ordinary person trying to survive the social chaos that erupted the moment darkness fell. You're waking up in a longhouse, but not to the gentle buzz of an alarm clock. You're jerked awake by the sound of Thorstein the Loud arguing with his wife Astrid about whether their neighbor Bjorn deliberately insulted their family's honor yesterday by not offering them the choicest cut of meat at dinner. This argument has been building for 3 hours, and everyone in the longhouse can hear every word because privacy simply doesn't exist. The longhouse stretches nearly 100 feet in length, housing not just Thorstein's family but his extended relatives, several farmhands, a few slaves, and whoever else has earned shelter for the night. You're all crammed together in what's essentially a single enormous room with a fire pit running down the center. The roof is low, the air is thick with smoke that never quite escapes, and personal space is a concept that won't be invented for several centuries. But here's what nobody tells you about Viking domestic life. The moment the sun went down, these people transformed. The stoic, disciplined warriors you've heard about in legends, they became gossiping, scheming, drinking, singing, fighting, laughing chaos agents who turned every evening into an unpredictable social experiment. Let's start with the drinking because sweet Odin. Did these people drink? And I'm not talking about a glass of wine with dinner. I'm talking about consuming quantities of mead and ale that would hospitalize a modern person. The drinking started before sunset and continued until people literally couldn't stand anymore. But this wasn't just casual social drinking. This was ritualistic, competitive, politically charged alcohol consumption that determined social status and settled disputes. The evening meal wasn't just about food. It was about demonstrating wealth, power, and generosity. The host was expected to provide not just sustenance but entertainment, and that entertainment got weird fast. Professional storytellers called skalds would recite epic poems that lasted for hours. But these weren't gentle bedtime stories. These were graphic, violent, sexually explicit tales of gods and heroes that would make modern horror movies seem tame. Between the stories, people played games that were part skill, part gambling, and part psychological warfare. They'd bet livestock, weapons, and even family members on dice games and board games that could literally change the course of someone's life. Imagine losing your freedom because you made a bad move in what was essentially medieval Monopoly. But the real wildness started when the social hierarchies began to break down under the influence of alcohol and darkness. Slaves who spent their days in complete subservience would suddenly find themselves engaged in drinking contests with their masters. Women who were expected to be quiet and obedient during the day became sharp-tongued poets who could destroy a man's reputation with a well-crafted insult. Children were allowed to stay up and witness adult behavior that would scandalize modern parents. The longhouse became a pressure cooker of personalities, grudges, romantic entanglements, and family drama. And remember, these people were stuck together all winter long. Every petty disagreement, every romantic rejection, every perceived slight got magnified and complicated by months of forced proximity and regular intoxication. The sleeping arrangements alone were a source of constant tension and intrigue. Married couples didn't get private bedrooms. They got sections of the longhouse separated by hanging tapestries if they were lucky. Everyone could hear everything. Every argument, every moment of intimacy, every snore and sneeze and midnight bathroom trip. The lack of privacy meant that personal conflicts became community entertainment. And speaking of romance, Viking courtship was nothing like the sanitized version you see in movies. Young people conducted elaborate, often dangerous games of attraction that involved public displays of skill, wealth, and verbal wit. But it wasn't just about impressing a potential partner. Every romantic interaction was watched, analyzed, and gossiped about by the entire community. A failed courtship attempt could become the subject of mocking songs that followed someone for years. The women, despite living in what we'd consider a male-dominated society, wielded considerable power in the domestic sphere. They could divorce their husbands for various reasons, including sexual inadequacy, which was discussed openly and in detail. They controlled household finances and could bankrupt families through poor management or strategic spending. They were expected to be skilled in poetry and could destroy enemies through carefully crafted verses that spread throughout the community. Children weren't shielded from adult realities the way modern kids are. They witnessed business negotiations, heard explicit stories, watched their parents drink themselves into stupors, and learned about violence, sex, and death as natural parts of life. By age 10, most Viking children had seen more raw human behavior than many modern adults experience in a lifetime. The legal system added another layer of chaos to Viking nights. Disputes that couldn't be resolved through discussion often escalated to formal duels or legal proceedings that were part courtroom drama, part public theater. These could drag on for hours, with the entire community serving as jury, judge, and entertainment audience. The accused might have to undergo trial by ordeal, walking across hot coals or being thrown into freezing water to prove their innocence. But perhaps the strangest aspect of Viking evening culture was their relationship with the supernatural. These people lived in a world where magic was not just believed in, but actively practiced. Every longhouse had someone who claimed the ability to see the future, communicate with the dead, or cast protective spells. Evening gatherings often included seances, fortune-telling, and magical rituals that blur the line between entertainment and genuine spiritual practice. The Seder practitioners, usually women, would enter trance states and allegedly communicate with spirits to provide guidance about everything from crop failures to battle strategies. These sessions could last all night, with the entire community participating through chanting, dancing, and offerings to various gods and spirits. And the gods themselves were constant presences in Viking daily life. Thor, Odin, Freya, and dozens of other deities were invoked for everything from successful hunting trips to protection from enemies to finding lost objects. Evening prayers weren't solemn, quiet affairs, but boisterous group activities that involved elaborate toasts, competitive boasting, and promises to perform great deeds worthy of divine attention. The violence that simmered beneath Viking society didn't disappear when the sun went down. If anything, alcohol and darkness made conflicts more likely to explode into actual bloodshed. Honor was everything to these people, and perceived slights that might be overlooked during the day became fighting matters after a few horns of mead. But the violence was ritualized and governed by complex social rules that determined when fighting was acceptable and when it crossed the line into criminal behavior. Men carried weapons constantly, even indoors, even during family meals. This wasn't just about practical protection, but about displaying status and readiness to defend one's honor. The sight of armed people conducting normal domestic activities created a constant undercurrent of potential violence that modern people would find unbearably stressful. Your muscles start to relax as you imagine this chaotic, alcohol-soaked, violence-tinged evening routine that somehow functioned as the social fabric holding these communities together. The contrast between their harsh, unforgiving environment and their elaborate, dramatic social lives is almost impossible to comprehend from our modern perspective. Tomorrow we'll dive even deeper into the specific rituals, games, and social customs that made Viking nights into something between a family reunion, a political convention, and a reality TV show. We'll explore the intricate marriage customs, the elaborate funeral practices, and the seasonal festivals that turned entire communities into week-long parties that would make modern music festivals look like quiet tea parties. But for now, as you settle into your peaceful private bedroom with its comfortable mattress and climate control, just remember that somewhere in medieval Scandinavia, 30 people are crammed into a smoky longhouse, drunk on mead, arguing about livestock theft while a skald recites a story about Thor's sexual adventures. And someone in the corner is trying to communicate with the spirit of their dead uncle to find out where they buried the family silver. Sweet dreams, modern sleeper. At least your biggest evening drama is probably just choosing what to watch on Netflix. But the real chaos began when winter arrived and the entire community was trapped indoors for months at a time. Imagine being locked in a house with 30 strangers, half-drunk relatives, and that one neighbor who never stops talking. Except this arrangement lasts from October to April. The longhouse became a social pressure cooker where every personality quirk, every bad habit, every unresolved grudge got amplified by cabin fever and perpetual intoxication. The seating arrangements around the central fire weren't random. They were a complex hierarchy that reflected wealth, age, family connections, and current political standing. Where you sat determined what food you received, who you could talk to, and whether anyone would listen to your opinions. People would literally fight over seating positions, and these disputes could escalate into blood feuds that lasted generations. But here's where it gets really wild. The Vikings had this concept called holmgang, which was essentially legalized dueling to settle disputes. Except these weren't dignified sword fights at dawn. These were brutal, often deadly encounters that could be triggered by the most trivial evening disagreements. Someone insults your beard. Holmgang. Someone questions your cow-counting skills. Holmgang. Someone suggests your mead tastes like horse urine. You guessed it, Holmgang. The women weren't passive observers in this testosterone-fueled madness. Viking women could demand divorces for reasons that would make modern relationship counselors blush. If your husband was sexually inadequate, couldn't provide proper clothing, or showed cowardice in battle, you could literally divorce him in front of the entire community. These divorce proceedings became public spectacles where intimate details were discussed with the casual frankness of people debating the weather. And speaking of intimate details, let's talk about Viking bathroom arrangements. Privacy was non-existent. The entire longhouse shared a single latrine pit, and bodily functions were communal experiences. People would conduct business meetings, share gossip, and settle disputes while relieving themselves. Important political decisions were made in what were essentially medieval porta potties. The children in these households were exposed to adult realities that would horrify modern parents. By age 8, most Viking kids had witnessed multiple violent deaths, participated in religious sacrifices involving animal blood, and heard detailed discussions about sex, money, and warfare. They weren't traumatized by this exposure because it was simply the reality of their world, but it created a generation of people who were pragmatic about violence and death in ways that modern humans struggle to comprehend. Entertainment took forms that would seem bizarre to contemporary audiences. One popular evening activity was competitive insulting, where people would trade increasingly creative and vicious verbal attacks until someone either conceded defeat or challenged the other to physical combat. These insult contests could last for hours and often became legendary, with particularly clever insults being remembered and repeated for decades. The storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was cultural programming. The sagas and epic poems weren't sanitized fairy tales, but graphic narratives that included detailed descriptions of torture, sexual violence, and psychological manipulation. Children absorbed these stories as instruction manuals for how to navigate a world where brutality was commonplace and mercy was often viewed as weakness. Religious practices were woven into daily life in ways that would seem intrusive to modern people. Every meal began with toasts to various gods. Every business transaction required divine approval, and every major decision involved consulting omens, runes, or spirit mediums. The longhouse often doubled as a temple, with religious ceremonies conducted in the same space where people ate, slept, and argued. The seasonal celebrations were particularly intense. During the winter solstice festival of Yule, communities would engage in 12 days of continuous feasting, drinking, and ritualistic behavior that included sacrificing animals, exchanging gifts, and conducting elaborate ceremonies to ensure the return of the sun. These weren't quiet, contemplative religious observances, but raucous parties where the entire community got collectively intoxicated while performing ancient rituals that may have included human sacrifice. Sleep itself was a community activity. People didn't retire to private bedrooms but arranged themselves around the longhouse according to social status and family relationships. The most important people slept closest to the fire, while slaves and low-status individuals were relegated to the coldest, smokiest areas near the walls. Snoring, sleep-talking, and nightmares became shared experiences that affected the entire household. The lack of artificial lighting meant that darkness governed everything. Once the sun set, activities were limited to what could be accomplished by firelight. This created an intimate, almost claustrophobic atmosphere where people were forced into close physical proximity for 12 to 14 hours every night. Personal space was literally impossible, and the concept of solitude was foreign. Medical care was a mixture of practical knowledge and supernatural belief. Injuries and illnesses were treated with herbal remedies, surgical procedures that would make modern doctors cringe, and magical incantations that were believed to be as effective as physical treatment. Evening medical emergencies became community events where everyone offered advice, assistance, and spiritual support. The economic system was based on personal relationships and mutual obligations rather than currency. Evening gatherings were when debts were discussed, business partnerships were formed, and economic disputes were resolved. These weren't formal meetings but organic conversations that emerged from the social mixing that happened around the fire every night. Food preparation and consumption were central to evening activities. Meals weren't quick, efficient affairs, but lengthy social events where people displayed wealth, negotiated relationships, and reinforced social hierarchies. The quality and quantity of food served reflected the host's status, and guests were expected to reciprocate with stories, entertainment, or future hospitality. The Viking concept of honor was so complex and all-consuming that it governed every social interaction. Maintaining face wasn't just about personal pride, but about family survival. A damaged reputation could result in social isolation, economic ruin, and physical danger. People were constantly navigating elaborate social protocols designed to avoid giving or taking offense, while simultaneously looking for opportunities to enhance their own standing at others' expense. Personal hygiene was communal and public. Vikings actually bathed more regularly than many other medieval peoples, but this was done in shared spaces where nudity and bodily functions were routine. The weekly bath was a social event where people of all ages and social classes would gather to clean themselves while conducting the same conversations and business that happened everywhere else. Marriage negotiations were lengthy, complex affairs that could take months to complete. Evening gatherings were when families would subtly evaluate potential matches, discuss dowries and bride prices, and navigate the intricate social networks that determined who could marry whom. Young people had some input in these decisions, but family politics and economic considerations were usually more important than personal preference. Death was an ever-present reality that was acknowledged and discussed openly. People died regularly from violence, disease, and accidents, and evening conversations often included updates on who was sick, who had died, and what this meant for the surviving family members. Funeral planning was routine dinner conversation, and people often discussed their own deaths with the casual matter-of-factness of modern people talking about retirement plans. The supernatural wasn't separate from daily life, but integrated into every activity. Evening gatherings regularly included consultations with spirits, interpretations of omens, and discussions of prophetic dreams. people believed that the dead remained active in the affairs of the living, and evening seances to communicate with deceased family members were as common as modern people checking their phones. Your breathing deepens as you contemplate this world where privacy was impossible. Violence was commonplace, and every evening was an unpredictable social experiment that could end in marriage, murder, or magical revelation. The contrast between their harsh realities and our comfortable modern routines becomes almost dreamlike as you drift towards sleep, grateful for your quiet bedroom and predictable evening routine. But we're not done exploring the depths of Viking domestic chaos. Tomorrow we'll delve into their seasonal festivals that turned entire communities into week-long orgies of feasting, fighting, and religious ecstasy. We'll examine their peculiar courtship rituals, their elaborate funeral customs, and their trading expeditions that were equal parts business venture and armed robbery. The trading expeditions deserve special attention because they reveal just how intertwined commerce and violence were in Viking society. These weren't peaceful merchant ventures, but armed expeditions where the line between trading and raiding was razor thin. Evening preparations for these journeys involved elaborate rituals, strategic planning sessions, and negotiations that could determine the fate of entire communities. Picture the scene. 30 armed men gathered around the fire, passing drinking horns while debating whether to approach the Frankish settlements as merchants or raiders. The decision often came down to reading the political climate, assessing military strength, and sometimes consulting the gods through dice rolls or rune casting. These weren't abstract discussions, but life or death planning sessions where a wrong choice could mean slavery or death for everyone involved. The ships themselves were marvels of engineering, but preparing them for long voyages was a community effort that transformed evening gatherings into shipyard meetings. Every piece of equipment had to be inspected, every crew member's loyalty had to be verified, and every possible scenario had to be discussed. The evening before departure, the entire longhouse would stay awake, conducting final preparations while consuming heroic quantities of alcohol to ensure divine favor. But let's talk about what happened when these expeditions returned. The homecoming wasn't just a family reunion, but a community-wide reckoning where profits were divided, stories were told, and social hierarchies were reshuffled based on who had shown courage and who had displayed cowardice. Evening celebrations could last for weeks, with returning warriors expected to provide entertainment through increasingly embellished tales of their adventures. The slave trade was central to Viking economics, and evening slave auctions were routine social events where human beings were bought and sold like livestock. These weren't hidden, shameful activities, but public spectacles where the community gathered to evaluate merchandise, negotiate prices, and determine the fate of captured foreigners. Children attended these auctions as naturally as modern kids attend garage sales. Slavery added another layer of complexity to longhouse dynamics. Slaves weren't just laborers, but potential concubines, adopted family members, and sources of entertainment. Their treatment varied wildly depending on their skills, origins, and the whims of their owners. Some slaves were brutally exploited while others became trusted advisors or even inherited property upon their master's death. The legal system that governed slave relationships was bewilderingly complex. Slaves could own property, testify in certain legal proceedings, and even purchase their freedom under specific circumstances. But they could also be killed without legal consequences, sold to settle debts, or sacrificed during religious ceremonies. Evening discussions about slave management were routine household conversations that revealed the casual brutality underlying Viking society. Sexual relationships in Viking communities were far more fluid than medieval Christian societies. Polygamy wasn't uncommon among wealthy men. Concubinage was socially accepted, and temporary marriages for specific purposes were legally recognized. Evening negotiations about these arrangements were conducted with the same practical attitude as livestock trading, with women's consent being largely irrelevant to the proceedings. The concept of rape as we understand it today didn't exist in Viking legal frameworks. Sexual violence was treated as property damage against the woman's male relatives rather than assault against the woman herself. Evening legal proceedings dealing with sexual crimes focused on compensation payments rather than punishment, with the woman's suffering being secondary to the economic damage done to her family. Homosexual relationships existed but were governed by strict social rules about dominance and submission. The passive partner in male relationships was considered socially inferior, while the active partner maintained his masculine status. These distinctions were discussed openly during evening gatherings, with people's sexual roles being as much a part of their social identity as their occupation or family lineage. Marriage dissolution was surprisingly common and could be initiated by either partner for various reasons. Evening divorce proceedings were public spectacles where intimate details of the couple's relationship were examined by the entire community. Grounds for divorce included everything from sexual inadequacy to poor personal hygiene, with witnesses called to testify about bedroom behavior and bathroom habits. Children from dissolved marriages became bargaining chips in complex custody arrangements that were determined by economic considerations rather than the child's well-being. Evening negotiations about child custody could drag on for months, with extended family members weighing in on decisions that would determine a child's future social status and inheritance rights. The seasonal rhythm of Viking life created different types of evening activities throughout the year. Summer nights were often spent outdoors conducting raids, trading expeditions, or agricultural work that continued until the late setting sun finally disappeared. Winter evenings were when the real social intensity happened, with communities locked indoors and forced to entertain themselves through increasingly creative and often destructive means. Spring evenings were dedicated to planning the year's activities, with lengthy discussions about which crops to plant, which expeditions to undertake, and which enemies to target for revenge. These weren't casual conversations, but strategic planning sessions, where the community's survival depended on making correct decisions about resource allocation and risk management. Autumn nights were harvest celebrations that could last for weeks, with communities consuming vast quantities of food and alcohol while preparing for the lean winter months ahead. These festivals included ritual competitions where people demonstrated their skills in everything from poetry to combat, with winners gaining social status and losers facing public humiliation. The religious calendar was packed with festivals that provided excuses for community-wide debauchery. Each god had specific celebration days that required appropriate rituals, sacrifices, and festivities. Evening preparations for these events involved elaborate planning that combined spiritual devotion with practical party organization. Blood sacrifice was central to Viking religious practice, and evening ceremonies often included the ritual killing of animals or occasionally humans. These weren't solemn, reverent occasions, but festive community gatherings where the entire population participated in acts that would horrify modern sensibilities. Children were expected to watch and learn, with participation in sacrificial rituals being considered essential education. The concept of fate was so central to Viking worldview that it influenced every evening decision. People believed that their destinies were predetermined by the Norns, the three sisters who wove the threads of fate. This fatalistic attitude created a culture where people took enormous risks because they believed that careful planning couldn't change what was destined to happen anyway. Divination was practiced constantly, with evening gatherings regularly interrupted by consultations with rune stones, examination of animal entrails, or interpretation of dreams and omens. These weren't occasional spiritual exercises, but routine decision-making tools that were considered as reliable as practical observation and logical reasoning. The warrior culture extended beyond actual combat to influence every aspect of social interaction. Evening conversations were conducted like verbal battles where wit, knowledge, and rhetorical skill were weapons used to gain advantage over opponents. People who couldn't hold their own in these intellectual combats lost social status regardless of their physical prowess or economic resources. Poetry wasn't just entertainment, but a form of psychological warfare where skilled skalds could destroy reputations through carefully crafted verses that spread throughout the community. Evening poetry competitions were gladiatorial contests where participants risked social annihilation if their verses were judged inferior by the audience. The memorial culture meant that everything people did was evaluated based on how it would be remembered after their death. Evening discussions often focused on which actions would create lasting fame and which would result in shameful obscurity. This created enormous pressure to constantly perform heroic deeds worthy of being recorded in saga literature. Your eyelids grow heavy as you contemplate this world, where every evening was an unpredictable mixture of business meeting, religious ceremony, legal proceeding, and social experiment. The complexity of their social interactions makes modern relationship drama seem refreshingly simple by comparison. The constant presence of violence, the casual acceptance of slavery, the fluid sexual relationships, and the integration of supernatural beliefs into daily decision-making created a society that was simultaneously more brutal and more emotionally honest than anything contemporary people experience. But there's still more to explore in this chaotic world of Viking domestic life. We haven't yet delved into their elaborate funeral practices that could bankrupt entire families, Their seasonal festivals that transformed communities into temporary autonomous zones of revelry and violence, or their complex system of oaths and obligations that bound people together in networks of mutual dependence and potential betrayal. Sleep comes easier now as you drift away from this world of smoky longhouses and endless social drama. Grateful for your quiet bedroom where the only decision you need to make is whether to set an alarm for tomorrow morning. The most fascinating aspect of Viking evening culture was their relationship with storytelling, but not the noble, heroic tales you might imagine. These were raw, unfiltered narratives that would make modern content warnings seem quaint. The skalds weren't just entertainers, they were walking Wikipedia databases of family scandals, political intrigue, and sexual dysfunction that stretched back generations. Picture this. You're sitting around the fire, mead horn in hand, when old Ragnar the storyteller stands up to regale the crowd with the saga of how Bjorn the Bold earned his nickname. Except it turns out Bjorn got his name not from battlefield courage, but from boldly propositioning his own stepmother at a wedding feast, resulting in a family feud that's still claiming lives 3 generations later. The children are listening to all of this with the same attention modern kids give to superhero movies. These stories served multiple functions beyond entertainment. They were legal precedents, genealogical records, and social instruction manuals all rolled into one. When disputes arose about property rights or marriage contracts, people would cite specific story details as legal evidence. Remember in the saga of Eric the Unfortunate when his cousin claimed the northern pasture? Well, that's exactly what's happening here with Olaf's sheep. The memorization skills required were absolutely staggering. Skalds could recite stories that lasted 8 to 10 hours without missing a single detail. These weren't written down anywhere. They existed only in human memory. A single skald's brain contained more narrative content than most modern libraries. But here's the catch. If you got the details wrong, you weren't just a bad entertainer. You were potentially destroying legal evidence or insulting powerful families who might express their displeasure through creative applications of sharp objects. The competitive aspect of storytelling created a bizarre form of intellectual combat. Skalds would challenge each other to recite increasingly obscure sagas with audiences judging not just accuracy but dramatic presentation. These contests could last all night, with reputations and sometimes actual property changing hands based on who could remember whether Thorvald the Terrible had 2 wives or 3 and which one poisoned his porridge. But the real wildness emerged when communities started creating new stories about recent events. Every evening's drama became potential saga material, with people knowing that their actions might be immortalized in verse that would be recited for centuries. This created a feedback loop where people behaved more dramatically because they wanted to star in interesting stories, which created even more dramatic material for future tales. The women weren't passive listeners in this narrative culture. Female storytellers specialized in particular types of tales, often focusing on domestic intrigue, supernatural encounters, and the secret lives of prominent men. These stories revealed information that could destroy political alliances or expose family secrets that had been carefully hidden for years. A skilled female storyteller could end marriages, start wars, or elevate nobodies to positions of power through strategic narrative choices. The supernatural elements weren't treated as fantasy, but as historical fact. Stories about gods walking among humans, witches cursing entire bloodlines, and dead warriors returning to settle unfinished business were accepted as reliable accounts of actual events. People made important decisions based on story details about divine intervention and supernatural consequences. Children absorbed these narratives as instruction manuals for adult behavior. By age 10, most Viking kids had heard hundreds of stories detailing every possible form of human treachery, sexual scandal, and violent revenge. They learned that loyalty was temporary, that family members could become enemies overnight, and that the most trusted friends might betray you for surprisingly trivial reasons. The seasonal variation in storytelling reflected the community's emotional needs. Winter stories were darker, focusing on survival, betrayal, and supernatural horror. Summer tales emphasized adventure, conquest, and heroic achievement. Spring narratives dealt with renewal, courtship, and the planning of ambitious projects. Autumn stories prepared people for the hardships ahead while celebrating the year's accomplishments. But perhaps most disturbing to modern sensibilities was the casual integration of extreme violence into everyday narratives. Children's bedtime stories included detailed descriptions of torture techniques, creative methods of execution, and the proper procedures for conducting human sacrifice. These weren't presented as cautionary tales, but as normal aspects of life that everyone needed to understand. The legal implications of storytelling created a bizarre intersection between entertainment and jurisprudence. Certain stories carried the weight of legal contracts, with specific narrative details serving as binding agreements between families or communities. Changing even minor story elements could invalidate treaties, property transfers, or marriage arrangements that had been in effect for decades. The economic impact of skilled storytellers was enormous. Communities would compete to attract the best skalds, offering substantial payment in livestock, weapons, or precious metals. A talented storyteller could support an entire extended family through their narrative skills, while poor storytellers might find themselves reduced to begging or manual labor. The psychological pressure on storytellers was intense. They weren't just entertainers, but custodians of cultural memory, legal witnesses, and social commentators all at once. A single memory lapse could trigger political crises, family feuds, or religious controversies that might last for generations. Many skalds developed elaborate mnemonic techniques that bordered on the supernatural, claiming divine inspiration or magical assistance in maintaining their narrative accuracy. The religious dimension of storytelling created another layer of complexity. Many stories were considered sacred texts that couldn't be altered without risking divine punishment. But the definition of sacred was fluid and often politically motivated, with powerful families claiming that stories about their ancestors were religiously protected, while stories about their enemies were fair game for creative interpretation. The traveling nature of many storytellers meant that different versions of the same stories circulated simultaneously, creating confusion and controversy when communities compared notes. Regional variations in narrative details could spark conflicts between settlements, with each group insisting that their version was the authentic original. The apprenticeship system for training storytellers was ruthlessly selective. Young people who showed promise were subjected to years of intensive memorization training that would break most modern students. They had to master not just the stories themselves, but the complex social protocols governing when specific narratives could be told and to which audiences. The integration of storytelling with other evening activities created a multimedia experience that modern entertainment can barely match. Stories were accompanied by music, dance, dramatic reenactments, and audience participation that transformed passive listening into immersive theater. The entire longhouse became a stage where everyone was simultaneously performer and audience. The darker side of storytelling culture was its use as a weapon of social control. Unfavorable stories could be created to destroy someone's reputation, while favorable narratives could elevate individuals beyond their actual accomplishments. The power to control narrative was the power to control reality, making storytellers some of the most politically influential people in Viking society. Your mind drifts as you consider this world where entertainment was indistinguishable from history, law, religion, and political propaganda, all mixed together in an alcoholic haze around a smoky fire. The responsibility of remembering everything perfectly while performing dramatically for audiences who might kill you for getting details wrong seems almost impossibly stressful. But the evening's entertainment was just beginning. Once the formal storytelling concluded, the real social chaos began. This was when the carefully maintained hierarchies started breaking down under the influence of alcohol and darkness. Servants began speaking freely to masters. Women started voicing opinions that would be unthinkable during daylight hours. And children witnessed adult behavior that would traumatize modern families. The drinking games alone were exercises in psychological warfare disguised as entertainment. People would compete to consume impossible quantities of alcohol while maintaining their ability to function socially, conduct business, and settle disputes. These weren't casual party games, but serious competitions where losing meant social humiliation and winning meant enhanced status within the community. The gambling that accompanied these drinking sessions involved stakes that could bankrupt families or elevate paupers to prosperity overnight. People bet livestock, land, weapons, family heirlooms, and sometimes their own freedom on contests of skill, chance, and endurance. The emotional swings from wealth to poverty and back again created a constant atmosphere of tension and excitement. The romantic entanglements that developed during these evening gatherings were complicated by the fact that everyone lived in such close proximity. Secret affairs were nearly impossible to keep secret, but they happened anyway, creating webs of sexual jealousy and romantic competition that influenced every aspect of community life. The morning after a particularly intense evening gathering, the social dynamics might be completely rearranged based on who had been seen whispering with whom in the shadows. The religious rituals that punctuated evening activities weren't solemn, contemplative practices, but ecstatic experiences designed to achieve altered states of consciousness. People would dance, chant, consume psychoactive substances, and engage in ritualistic behaviors that would seem bizarre to modern religious practitioners. The boundary between worship and intoxication was deliberately blurred, with spiritual revelation often indistinguishable from alcohol-induced hallucinations. The business negotiations that took place during evening gatherings were conducted in an atmosphere of competitive hospitality, where each party tried to outdo the others in displays of wealth and generosity. These weren't formal meetings but elaborate social performances where economic agreements were reached through complex rituals of gift-giving, storytelling, and mutual obligation. The educational aspect of evening gatherings was particularly intense for young people who were learning to navigate adult society. They observed every interaction, absorbed every lesson about power dynamics, and gradually began participating in the complex social games that would determine their future status within the community. The seasonal festivals that punctuated the Viking calendar transformed these nightly gatherings into week-long celebrations that pushed community endurance to its absolute limits. During these extended celebrations, normal social rules were suspended, creating temporary periods of chaos where almost anything could happen. The winter solstice celebration of Yule was particularly intense, with communities engaging in ritualistic behaviors that combined religious devotion, social bonding, and collective intoxication in ways that created profound psychological experiences for participants. These weren't just parties, but transformative community experiences that reinforced cultural values while providing outlets for social tensions. The spring fertility festivals involved ritualistic activities that would shock modern sensibilities, with entire communities participating in ceremonies designed to ensure agricultural success through sympathetic magic that included explicit sexual symbolism and actual sexual activity conducted as religious practice. Your breathing slows as you contemplate this world where every evening was an unpredictable mixture of entertainment, business, education, religion, and social experimentation. The intensity of their community life, where privacy was impossible and every personal interaction had public consequences, creates a stark contrast with modern isolation and digital connection. The complexity of their social relationships, where every person was connected to every other person, through multiple overlapping networks of obligation, competition, and interdependence, makes contemporary social media seem almost simple by comparison. They lived in a world where your reputation was literally everything, where a single evening's poor decision could affect your descendants for generations, and where survival depended on maintaining complex social relationships that required constant attention and careful management. But there's still more to explore in this chaotic world of Viking evening culture. We haven't yet examined their elaborate funeral practices that could involve human sacrifice, their trading relationships that blurred the line between commerce and warfare, or their legal system that treated violence as a legitimate form of dispute resolution. The funeral practices deserve special attention because they reveal how death was integrated into daily life in ways that modern people would find overwhelming. When someone died, The entire community became involved in elaborate ceremonies that could last for weeks and might involve the sacrifice of slaves, the burning of valuable possessions, and ritualistic activities that were designed to ensure the deceased's successful transition to the afterlife. Evening preparations for these funeral ceremonies involved the entire community in activities that combined practical planning with religious ritual and social positioning. Families would compete to demonstrate their devotion to the deceased through increasingly elaborate displays of grief and generosity, with the quality and scale of funeral preparations serving as public statements about family status and resources. Sleep begins to embrace you as you drift away from this world of smoky longhouses and endless social complexity. Grateful for your quiet bedroom where the most dramatic evening activity might be choosing what to binge-watch before bed, and where your biggest social obligation is remembering to text your friends back sometime before next week. The funeral arrangements weren't just about honoring the dead. They were elaborate social competitions where families bankrupted themselves trying to prove their status and devotion. When Bjorn the blacksmith died last winter, his family spent 3 months planning a send-off that included burning 2 ships, sacrificing 14 animals, and providing enough mead to keep the entire community drunk for a week. His widow Ingrid sold half their property to fund the spectacle, leaving her children impoverished but socially elevated. The evening preparations for these funeral marathons transformed the longhouse into a combination wake, business negotiation, and family therapy session. Relatives would arrive from hundreds of miles away, each carrying their own grievances, demands, and interpretations of what the deceased would have wanted. Old feuds resurged as people argued over inheritance rights while simultaneously planning ritualistic activities that might include human sacrifice if the deceased had been particularly important. The slave sacrifices weren't quick, merciful affairs, but elaborate ceremonies where the chosen victims were given starring roles in multi-day rituals. These slaves, usually young women, were treated like honored guests for weeks before their deaths, fed the finest foods, dressed in expensive clothing, and consulted for their opinions on funeral arrangements. The psychological complexity of this treatment, elevating someone to goddess status before killing them, created an atmosphere of surreal tension that affected everyone involved. But here's what really made Viking funerals wild. The drinking contests weren't just about honoring the dead, but about redistributing social power among the living. People would compete to demonstrate their devotion through increasingly dangerous displays of alcohol consumption, with winners gaining influence over funeral arrangements and losers facing public humiliation during their moment of grief. The burial mounds themselves became permanent monuments to family wealth and status. But building them required community cooperation that could strain relationships for years. Everyone was expected to contribute labor, materials, or expertise, and the quality of their contributions was carefully noted and remembered. Skimping on your funeral obligations could result in social exile when your own family members needed burial assistance. The grave goods were selected through complex negotiation that revealed every family secret and financial arrangement. Weapons, jewelry, household items, and livestock were chosen not just for their practical value in the afterlife, but for their symbolic meaning to the living community. Including someone's favorite drinking horn or excluding their prized sword sent messages that would be discussed for generations. The seasonal timing of deaths created additional complications. Because Viking funerals couldn't be conducted during certain weather conditions or religious periods, bodies might be preserved for months while families waited for appropriate burial conditions. And the deceased's spirit was believed to remain active in household affairs until proper funeral rites were completed. Imagine living with your dead grandmother's corpse in the corner while she continues to offer unsolicited opinions about your life choices. The trading expeditions that punctuated Viking life were equally chaotic because they combined legitimate commerce with opportunistic piracy in ways that kept everyone guessing about their true intentions. A group might set out as peaceful merchants and return as conquering raiders or vice versa, depending on what opportunities they encountered along the way. Evening planning sessions for these expeditions were exercises in strategic ambiguity where participants had to prepare for multiple scenarios while maintaining plausible deniability about their actual intentions. The same weapons and supplies could be justified as defensive precautions or offensive equipment depending on how events unfolded. And crew members were selected for their ability to transition seamlessly between merchant and warrior roles. The navigation techniques used during these expeditions were surprisingly sophisticated, involving careful observation of stars, currents, bird behavior, and weather patterns that allowed Vikings to cross vast ocean distances with remarkable accuracy. But the knowledge required was closely guarded by experienced navigators who might deliberately provide false information to potential competitors. The international relationships that developed through trading were fascinatingly complex because Vikings often maintained simultaneous relationships as trading partners and military enemies with the same communities. They might peacefully exchange goods with Frankish merchants in the morning and raid the same settlement that evening, creating diplomatic situations that required extraordinary social flexibility. The linguistic skills developed through trading were remarkable, with many Vikings becoming fluent in multiple languages and familiar with diverse cultural practices. But this cosmopolitan sophistication coexisted with brutal xenophobia that allowed them to dehumanize foreigners when convenient for raiding purposes. The economic calculations involved in deciding between trading and raiding were surprisingly sophisticated, with Vikings developing complex risk assessment techniques that factored in everything from seasonal weather patterns to local political instability. These weren't impulsive barbarians but calculated entrepreneurs who understood that violence was sometimes more profitable than commerce. The legal system that governed Viking society was perhaps the most fascinating aspect of their culture, because it treated violence as a legitimate form of dispute resolution, while maintaining elaborate procedures for determining when such violence was justified. The evening legal proceedings weren't formal courtroom dramas, but community-wide discussions that could last for days and involve everyone in heated debates about guilt, innocence, and appropriate punishment. The concept of weregild, blood money paid to compensate for injuries or deaths, created a complex economic system where human life had specific monetary values that varied based on social status, age, gender, and circumstances of the harm. These calculations were conducted with the same precision modern people use for insurance claims, except the negotiations took place in public forums where everyone could witness and influence the proceedings. The trial by ordeal procedures used to determine guilt or innocence were based on supernatural beliefs that modern people would find absurd, but they served important social functions by providing definitive resolution to disputes that might otherwise fester indefinitely. Watching someone walk across hot coals or survive being thrown into freezing water created powerful psychological experiences that reinforced community beliefs about divine justice. The blood feuds that resulted from unresolved legal disputes could persist for generations, creating hereditary obligations for revenge that shaped family relationships in ways that modern people struggle to comprehend. Children grew up knowing that they might be required to kill specific individuals to fulfill family honor obligations, regardless of any personal feelings about the matter. The peacemaking rituals used to end feuds were as elaborate as the conflicts themselves, involving complex ceremonies that might include marriages between enemy families, shared meals with ritualistic significance, and formal oath-taking that bound entire communities to maintain peaceful relationships. Your muscles relax as you contemplate this world where every aspect of life was governed by intricate social protocols that balanced individual desires against community needs, while maintaining the constant threat of violence as the ultimate arbiter of disputes. The psychological pressure of living under such conditions where every social interaction carried potential life or death consequences seems almost unbearable from a modern perspective. The seasonal celebrations that provided relief from daily tensions were themselves sources of additional stress because they required elaborate preparations, substantial financial investments, and flawless social performance during community-wide events where everyone's behavior was scrutinized and remembered. The harvest festivals weren't just agricultural celebrations, but complex ceremonies that combined Thanksgiving rituals with competitive displays of wealth, skill, and social status. Communities would compete to provide the most elaborate feasts, the most entertaining performances, and the most generous gifts to ensure divine favor for the coming year. The midsummer celebrations involved ritualistic activities that pushed community bonds to their limits through shared experiences of extreme behavior that might include group nudity, sexual experimentation, and collective consumption of psychoactive substances. These weren't casual parties, but transformative community experiences designed to strengthen social cohesion through shared transgression of normal behavioral boundaries. The midwinter festivals were particularly intense because they occurred during the darkest, coldest period when communities were trapped indoors and dependent on stored resources for survival. These celebrations served as pressure release valves that prevented cabin fever from destroying social relationships. But they also created opportunities for conflicts to explode into violence when people had nowhere to escape from each other. The religious dimensions of these festivals involved beliefs and practices that would seem bizarre to modern people but served important psychological functions in helping communities cope with the uncertainties and hardships of their harsh environment. The integration of supernatural beliefs into daily decision-making created a worldview where practical planning coexisted with magical thinking in ways that provided comfort and meaning during difficult times. The artistic expressions that emerged during these celebrations, poetry, music, visual arts, and storytelling, weren't just entertainment but sophisticated forms of cultural communication that preserved and transmitted essential information about survival techniques, social relationships, and spiritual beliefs. The competitive aspects of these celebrations created temporary inversions of normal social hierarchies where slaves might defeat masters in contests of skill or wit. Women might outperform men in displays of strength or intelligence, and children might demonstrate superior knowledge or ability compared to their elders. But perhaps most remarkably, these communities managed to maintain social cohesion despite the constant presence of violence, the absence of privacy, the extreme weather conditions, and the perpetual uncertainty about food security and physical safety. Their evening gatherings served as the social glue that held everything together, creating bonds strong enough to survive the incredible stresses of their environment. Your breathing deepens as you drift towards sleep, carrying with you images of smoky longhouses filled with complex, chaotic, passionate people who lived every moment with an intensity that makes modern life seem almost ghostly by comparison. Their world was brutal and beautiful, terrifying and fascinating, a place where every evening was an adventure and every night brought possibilities that could change everything by morning. The contrast between their wild, unpredictable existence and your peaceful, climate-controlled bedroom becomes a lullaby that carries you gently toward dreams. Grateful for the quiet certainty of waking up tomorrow in a world where your biggest evening drama might be choosing between streaming services, and where the most dangerous thing in your bedroom is probably the risk of stubbing your toe on the way to the bathroom. But even as sleep embraces you, something lingers from this journey into Viking domestic life. A recognition that beneath our modern comforts and conveniences we're still the same species that once gathered around fires in smoky longhouses, telling stories and sharing mead while navigating the eternal human challenges of love, power, survival, and meaning. Sweet dreams, modern sleeper. At least your evening entertainment doesn't involve dodging flying axes or negotiating your way out of blood feuds. Though sometimes watching people argue on social media almost makes you nostalgic for the days when conflicts were settled with straightforward violence instead of passive-aggressive subtweeting. Sleep takes you gently now, but not before one final glimpse into the most intimate aspects of Viking evening life that we haven't yet explored. Because beneath all the drinking and fighting and storytelling, these were still people dealing with the same fundamental human needs we face today, just in ways that would make your modern sensibilities recoil in horror. Let's talk about Viking hygiene, because nothing says romantic evening like communal bathing in water that hasn't been changed since the last full moon. Saturday nights weren't for going out. They were for the weekly community bath where everyone from the Jarl's family to the lowliest thrall would gather around heated stones and buckets of questionable water for what passed as personal grooming. The bathing ritual wasn't the relaxing spa experience you might imagine. Picture 30 people of all ages crowded into a steamy outbuilding sharing the same water, the same soap made from animal fat and ash, and the same general attitude that cleanliness was more about social obligation than personal comfort. The water was heated by dropping red-hot stones into wooden tubs, creating a scalding, mineral-rich soup that would strip skin as efficiently as it removed dirt. But here's where it gets interesting from a social perspective. The bathing order was strictly hierarchical. The most important person went first with the cleanest water, and by the time the slaves got their turn, they were essentially washing in a lukewarm broth of everyone else's discarded filth. Yet somehow this weekly torture session became a bonding ritual where people shared gossip, conducted business, and settled disputes while stark naked and vulnerable. The Vikings actually had a reputation among other medieval peoples for being obsessively clean, which tells you something about just how filthy everyone else was. They bathed weekly, washed their hair regularly, and even had a primitive form of dental hygiene involving twigs and salt. But their standards of cleanliness were still medieval, which meant that clean was a relative concept that would horrify anyone with access to modern plumbing. The sleeping arrangements in longhouses created their own unique forms of evening entertainment. With entire extended families sharing a single large room, privacy was achieved through hanging cloth partitions that blocked vision but did absolutely nothing about sound. This meant that every intimate moment, every argument, every bodily function became community knowledge, whether you wanted it to or not. Young couples trying to start families had to conduct their romantic lives within earshot of grandparents, siblings, cousins, and household slaves. The pressure to perform quietly while simultaneously being expected to produce heirs created a psychological minefield that would challenge even the most confident individuals. Imagine trying to maintain passion while knowing that your mother-in-law is lying 3 feet away, probably listening and taking mental notes for future family discussions. The children who grew up in these environments developed a sophisticated understanding of adult relationships that would seem inappropriate by modern standards. By age 10, most Viking children had absorbed detailed knowledge about sexuality, pregnancy, childbirth, and family dynamics simply through unavoidable exposure to adult life. This wasn't considered harmful. It was practical education for people who would need to navigate complex social relationships from a very young age. The medical practices that governed evening health care were a fascinating mixture of practical knowledge and supernatural belief. When someone fell ill during the long winter nights, the entire community became involved in diagnosis and treatment through methods that combined herbal remedies, surgical procedures, and magical incantations in equal measure. The Viking approach to mental health was particularly sophisticated for its time, recognizing that isolation and social rejection could be as deadly as physical injuries. Evening gatherings served therapeutic functions by ensuring that everyone remained connected to the community support network, Even during times of personal crisis or social disgrace, pregnancy and childbirth in Viking society were community events that transformed evening gatherings into extended medical conferences where everyone offered advice, assistance, and opinions about everything from dietary requirements to supernatural precautions. Pregnant women weren't isolated or treated as invalids but remained active participants in social life until the moment of delivery. The actual childbirth process was attended by experienced women from throughout the community, with evening labor sessions becoming intense group experiences where multiple generations of women shared knowledge, encouragement, and practical assistance. These weren't sterile medical procedures, but chaotic emotional events where the boundary between life and death was negotiated through collective effort and divine intervention. The high infant mortality rates meant that every successful birth was celebrated as a community victory, while infant deaths became shared traumas that affected everyone involved. Evening mourning rituals for lost children were particularly intense because they represented not just individual grief but collective failure to protect the community's future. The child naming ceremonies that followed successful births were elaborate evening celebrations that combined religious ritual with social positioning and family politics. Names weren't just personal identifiers but statements about family aspirations, spiritual beliefs, and political affiliations that would influence the child's entire life. The coming-of-age rituals for adolescents were particularly intense experiences that marked the transition from childhood to adult responsibilities through evening ceremonies that might last for days. These rituals often involved physical challenges, spiritual quests, and social tests that determined the young person's future status within the community. Your eyelids grow heavier as you contemplate this world where every life transition was marked by community celebration, where individual experiences became collective memories, and where the line between public and private life was so blurred as to be essentially meaningless. The intensity of their social connections created bonds that modern people, with our emphasis on independence and privacy, struggle to imagine. But there's something deeply moving about their approach to community life, despite all its chaos and violence and lack of personal space. These people understood that human beings are fundamentally social creatures who need connection, purpose, and belonging to thrive. Their evening gatherings weren't just entertainment, they were essential infrastructure for maintaining the psychological and emotional health of the entire community. The seasonal rhythms that governed their lives created natural cycles of activity and rest that aligned human behavior with environmental conditions in ways that modern people have largely lost. Their long winter evenings weren't periods of boredom or depression, but intensive social seasons when communities strengthened their bonds and prepared for the challenges ahead. The storytelling traditions that preserved their history and values weren't passive entertainment, but active processes of cultural creation where everyone participated in shaping the narratives that defined their identity. Every evening gathering was an opportunity to influence how events would be remembered and what lessons would be passed down to future generations. The economic relationships that governed their society were embedded in personal connections rather than abstract market forces, creating a system where individual success was tied to community welfare in ways that made pure selfishness literally suicidal. Their evening business negotiations weren't just about profit, but about maintaining the social relationships that made survival possible. The religious practices that guided their daily decisions provided frameworks for understanding suffering, uncertainty, and mortality that helped people cope with lives that were genuinely harsh and dangerous. Their evening rituals weren't just spiritual exercises, but psychological tools for maintaining hope and purpose in the face of constant adversity. The artistic expressions that emerged from their culture, poetry, music, visual arts, and craftsmanship, weren't luxuries for the wealthy but essential elements of community life that provided meaning and beauty even in the most difficult circumstances. Every evening gathering included opportunities for creative expression that connected individuals to something larger than their immediate survival needs. The competitive elements that permeated their social interactions weren't just about dominance or status, but about pushing everyone to develop their full potential through constant challenge and mutual improvement. Their evening contests and competitions created environments where people discovered and refined abilities they never knew they possessed. Your breathing slows to match the ancient rhythms of communal rest as you drift away from this world of smoky longhouses and endless social complexity. The contrast between their intense interconnected existence and modern isolation becomes a bridge between past and present, carrying you gently towards sleep with the recognition that beneath all our technological advancement, we're still the same species that once huddled around fires sharing stories and mead. The Viking evenings we've explored together reveal something essential about human nature that transcends historical periods and cultural differences. Despite their violence and chaos, despite their lack of privacy and modern comforts, these people created communities that provided meaning, purpose, and connection in ways that many contemporary people struggle to find. Their wild nights weren't just about entertainment or escape. They were about creating and maintaining the social bonds that made survival possible in a harsh and unpredictable world. Every evening gathering was an investment in relationships that might mean the difference between life and death when crisis struck. As you settle into your comfortable, private, climate-controlled bedroom, carry with you this final thought. Those Viking ancestors who lived such intense, dramatic, chaotic lives were your people. Their DNA flows in your veins, their capacity for courage and creativity and community lives in your genes, and their wild spirits whisper in your dreams. Sweet dreams, modern warrior. May your sleep be peaceful and your morning coffee strong, because you've earned the luxury of boring evenings after witnessing what passed for normal nightlife 1,000 years ago. And with that gentle blessing from the smoky longhouses of medieval Scandinavia, let the wild Viking nights fade into memory as you drift toward whatever dreams may come. Grateful for the quiet certainty that your biggest evening drama tomorrow will probably involve nothing more dangerous than choosing what to stream or whether to order takeout. The fires have burned low now, The mead horns are empty, and even the most determined storytellers have finally fallen silent. Rest well, knowing that you've survived a journey through one of history's most chaotic domestic scenes and lived to tell the tale.